The Martin B-26 Marauder was a World War II twin-engined medium bomber built by the Glenn L. Martin Company. First used in the Pacific Theater in early 1942, it was also used in the Mediterranean Theater and in Western Europe. After entering service with the U.S. Army, the aircraft received the reputation of a Widowmaker due to the early model's high rate of accidents during takeoff and landings. The Marauder had to be flown at exact airspeeds, particularly on final runway approach and when one engine was out. The 150 mph speed on short final runway approach was intimidating to pilots who were used to much slower speeds, and whenever they slowed down below what the manual stated, the aircraft would stall and crash. The B-26 became a safer aircraft once crews were retrained, and after aerodynamics modifications. After aerodynamic and design changes, the aircraft distinguished itself as the chief bombardment weapon in the Western Front according to a United States Army Air Forces dispatch from 1946. The Marauder ended World War II with the lowest loss rate of any USAAF bomber. A total of 5,288 were produced between February 1941 and March 1945. 522 of these were flown by the Royal Air Force and the South African Air Force. By the time the United States Air Force was created as an independent service separate from the Army in 1947, all Martin B-26s had been retired from U.S. service. The Douglas A-26 Invader then assumed the B-26 designation a year before officially returning to the earlier A for attack designation in May 1966. Design and development. In March 1939, the United States Army Air Corps issued Circular Proposal 39-640, a specification for a twin-engined medium bomber, demanding a maximum speed of 350 mph, a range of 3,000 mi and a bomb load of 2,000 lb. On July 5, 1939, the Glenn L. Martin Company submitted its design, produced by a team led by Peyton M. Magruder, to meet the requirement, the Martin Model 179. Martin's design was evaluated as superior to the other proposals and was awarded a contract for 201 aircraft, to be designated B-26. The B-26 went from paper concept to an operational bomber in approximately 2 years. Additional orders for a further 930 B-26s followed in September 1940, still prior to the first flight of the type. The B-26 was a shoulder-winged monoplane of all-metal construction, fitted with a tricycle landing gear. It had a streamlined, circular section fuselage housing the crew, consisting of a bombardier in the nose, which was armed with a .30 in machine gun, a pilot and co-pilot sitting side by side, with positions for the radio operator and navigator behind the pilots. A gunner manned a dorsal turret armed with 2.50 in machine guns, while an additional .30 in machine gun was fitted in the tail. 2 bomb bays were fitted mid-fuselage, capable of carrying 5,800 lb of bombs, although in practice such a bomb load reduced range too much, and the aft bomb bay was usually fitted with additional fuel tanks instead of bombs. It was powered by 2 Pratt & Whitney A2800 Double Wasp radial engines in nacelles slung under the wing, driving 4-bladed propellers. The engines were manufactured at the Ford Dearborn Engine Plant in Dearborn, Michigan, USA. The wings were of low aspect ratio and relatively small area for an aircraft of its weight, giving the required high performance, but also resulting in a wing loading of 53 pound per square foot for the initial versions, which at the time was the highest of any aircraft accepted for service by the Army Air Corps. The first B-26, with Martin test pilot William K. Ken Bell at the controls, flew on November 25, 1940 and was effectively the prototype. Deliveries to the U.S. Army Air Corps began in February 1941 with the second aircraft, 40-1362. In March 1941, the Army Air Corps started accelerated service testing of the B-26 at Patterson Field, Ohio. Accidents. While the B-26 was a fast aircraft with better performance than the contemporary North American B-25 Mitchell, its relatively small wing area and resulting high wing loading required an unprecedented landing speed of 120 to 135 mph indicated airspeed depending on load. At least two of the earliest B-26s suffered hard landings and damage to the main landing gear, engine mounts, propellers and fuselage. The type was grounded briefly in April 1941 to investigate the landing difficulties. Two causes were found: insufficient landing speed and improper weight distribution. The latter was due to the lack of a dorsal turret. The Martin power turret was not ready yet. Some of the very earliest B-26s suffered collapses of the nose landing gear. It is said that they were caused by improper weight distribution, but that is not likely to have been the only reason. They occurred during low-speed taxiing, takeoffs and landings, and occasionally the strut unlocked. Later the Martin electric dorsal turret was retrofitted to some of the first B-26s. Martin also began testing a taller vertical stabilizer and revised tailgunner's position in 1941. The Pratt & Whitney A2800-5 engines were reliable, but the Curtiss electric pitch change mechanism in the propellers required impeccable maintenance, not always attainable in the field. Human error and some failures of the mechanism occasionally place the propeller blades in flat pitch, resulting in an overspeeding propeller, sometimes known as a runaway prop. Due to its sound and the possibility that the propeller blades could disintegrate, this situation was particularly frightening for air crews. More challenging was a loss of power in one engine during takeoff. These and other malfunctions, as well as human error, claimed a number of aircraft and the commanding officer of the 22nd Bombardment Group, Colonel Mark Lewis. The Martin B-26 suffered only two fatal accidents during its first year of flights, November 1940 November 1941, a crash shortly after takeoff near Martin's Middle River plant and the loss of a 38th Bombardment Group B-26 when its vertical stabilizer and rudder separated from the aircraft at altitude. The B-26 was not an aircraft for novices. Unfortunately, due to the need for training many pilots quickly for the war, a number of relatively inexperienced pilots got into the cockpit and the accident rate increased accordingly. This occurred at the same time as more experienced B-26 pilots of the 22nd, 38th and 42d bombardment groups were proving the merits of the bomber. For a time in 1942, pilots in training believed that the B-26 could not be flown on one engine. This was disproved by a number of experienced pilots, including Jimmy Doolittle. In 1942, Glenn Martin was called before the Senate Special Committee to investigate the National Defense Program, or Truman Committee, which was investigating defense contracting abuses. Senator Harry Truman, the committee chairman, asked Martin why the B-26 had troubles. Martin responded that the wings were too short. Truman asked why the wings weren't changed. When Martin said the plans were too far along and besides, his company already had the contract, Truman's response was quick and to the point: in that case, the contract would be cancelled. Martin said corrections to the wings would be made. Of wingspan, plus uprated engines, more armor and larger guns. Indeed, the regularity of crashes by pilots training at MacDill Field up to 15 in one 30-day period led to the exaggerated catchphrase, "one a day in Tampa Bay." Apart from accidents occurring over land, 13 Marauders ditched in Tampa Bay in the 14 months between the first one on August 5, 1942 to the final one on October 8, 1943. B-26 crews gave the aircraft the nickname Widowmaker. Other colorful nicknames included Martin Murderer, Flying Coffin, B-Crash, Flying Prostitute, and Baltimore Whore. According to an article in the April 2009 edition of AOPA Pilot on Kermit Week's Fantasy of Flight, the Marauder had a tendency to hunt in yaw. This instability is similar to Dutch roll. This would make for a very uncomfortable ride, especially for the tail gunner. The B-26 is stated by the 9th Air Force to have had the lowest combat loss rate of any U.S. aircraft used during the war. Nevertheless, it remained a challenging aircraft to fly and continued to be unpopular with some pilots throughout its military career. In 1944, in answer to many pilots complaining to the press and their relatives back home, the USAAF and Martin took the unusual step during war, of commissioning large articles to be placed in various popular publications, educating, and defending the so-called flying accident record of the B-26 against Flanders. One of the largest of these articles was in the May 1944 issue of Popular Mechanics. Operational history. The B-26 Marauder was used mostly in Europe but also saw action in the Mediterranean and the Pacific. In early combat the aircraft took heavy losses but was still one of the most successful medium-range bombers used by the U.S. Army Air Forces. The B-26 was initially deployed on combat missions in the Southwest Pacific in the spring of 1942, but most of the B-26s subsequently assigned to operational theaters were sent to England and the Mediterranean area. By the end of World War II, it had flown more than 110,000 sorties and had dropped 150,000 tons of bombs, and had been used in combat by British, Free French and South African forces in addition to U.S. units. In 1945, when B-26 production was halted, 5,266 had been built. Pacific Theater, the B-26 began to equip the 22nd Bombardment Group at Langley Field, Virginia in February 1941, replacing the B-18 Bolo, with a further two groups, the 38th and 28th, beginning to equip with the B-26 by December 1941. Immediately following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the 22nd Berg was deployed to the Southwest Pacific, first by ship to Hawaii, then its air echelon flew the planes to Australia. The 22nd Berg flew its first combat mission, an attack on Rabaul which required an intermediate stop at Port Moresby, New Guinea, on April 5, 1942. A second group, the 38th Bombardment Group, began receiving B-26s in November 1941 and began transition into them at Patterson Field, Ohio. There, the 38th continued the testing of the B-26, including its range and fuel efficiency. Immediately after the entry of the United States into World War II, plans were tentatively developed to send the 38th Berg to the Southwest Pacific and to equip it with B-26Bs fitted with more auxiliary fuel tanks and provisions for carrying aerial torpedoes. Three 38th Berg B-26Bs were detached to Midway Island in the build-up to the Battle of Midway, and two of them, along with two B-26s detached from the 22nd Berg, carried out torpedo attacks against the Japanese fleet on June 4, 1942. Two were shot down and the other two were so badly damaged that they were written off after the mission. Their torpedoes failed to hit any Japanese ships, although they did shoot down one Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter, and killed two seamen aboard the aircraft carrier Akagi with machine gun fire. From approximately June 1942 the B-26 squadrons of the 38th Berg were based in New Caledonia and Fiji. From New Caledonia, missions were flown against Japanese bases in the Solomon Islands. On one occasion, a B-26 was credited with shooting down a Cornish H-6K flying boat. In 1943 it was decided that the B-26 would be phased out of operations in the Southwest Pacific Theater in favor of the North American B-25 Mitchell. Nevertheless, the 19th Bombardment Squadron of the 22nd Berg continued to fly missions in the B-26, and the B-26 flew its last combat mission in the theater on January 9, 1944. Two more squadrons of torpedo-armed B-26s equipped the 28th Composite Group and were used for anti-shipping operations in the Aleutian Islands campaign, but there are no records of any successful torpedo attack by a USAAF B-26. Mediterranean Theater, 3 bombardment groups were allocated to support the Allied invasion of French North Africa in November 1942. They were initially used to carry out low-level attacks against heavily defended targets, receiving heavy losses with poor results, before switching to medium-level attacks. By the end of the North Africa campaign, the 3 B-26 groups had flown 1,587 sorties, losing 80 aircraft. This was double the loss rate of the B-25, which also flew 70% more sorties with fewer aircraft. Despite this, the B-26 continued in service with the 12th Air Force, supporting the Allied advance through Sicily, Italy and southern France. Air Marshal Slessor considered the 42nd Bombardment Group to be the best day bomber unit in the world. Northwest Europe. The B-26 entered service with the 8th Air Force in England in early 1943, with the 322d Bombardment Group flying its first missions in May 1943. Missions were similar to those flown in North Africa, with B-26s flying at low level and were unsuccessful. The second mission, an unescorted attack on a power station at IJmuiden, Netherlands, resulted in the loss of the entire attacking force of 11 B-26s to anti-aircraft fire and Luftwaffe Focke-Wulf FW-190 fighters. Following this disaster, the UK-based B-26 force was switched to medium-altitude operations, and transferred to the 9th Air Force, set up to support the planned invasion of France. Bombing from medium altitudes of 10,000 to 15,000 feet and with appropriate fighter escort, the Marauder proved far more successful, striking against a variety of targets, including bridges and V-1 launching sites in the build-up to D-Day, and moving to bases in France as they became available. The Marauder operating from medium altitude proved to be a highly accurate bomber, with the 9th Air Force rating it the most accurate bomber available in the final month of the war in Europe. Loss rates were far lower than in the early, low-level days, with the B-26 stated by the 9th Air Force as having the lowest loss rate in the European theatre of operations at less than 0.5%. The B-26 flew its last combat missions against the German garrison at the Aile-Dola copyright run on May 1, 1945, with the last units disbanding in early 1946. British Commonwealth, in 1942, a batch of 52 B-26A Marauders were offered to the United Kingdom under Lend-Lease. Like the earlier Martin, Maryland and Baltimore bombers, these were sent to the Mediterranean, replacing the Bristol Blenheims of No. 14 Squadron in Egypt. No. 14 Squadron flew its first operational mission on November 6, 1942, being used for long-range reconnaissance, mine-laying and anti-shipping strikes. Unlike the USAAF, 14 Squadron made productive use of the equipment for carrying torpedoes, sinking several merchant ships with this weapon. The Marauder also proved useful in disrupting enemy air transport, shooting down considerable numbers of German and Italian transport aircraft flying between Italy and North Africa. In 1943, deliveries of 100 long-wingspan B-26 C-30s, allowed two squadrons of the South African Air Force, 12 and 24 Squadron to be equipped, these being used for bombing missions over the Aegean, Crete and Italy. A further 350 B-26F and GS were supplied in 1944, with two more South African squadrons joining No. 12 and 24 in Italy to form an all-Marauder-equipped wing, while one further SAAF squadron and a newer AF squadron re-equipped with Marauders as part of the Balkan Air Force supporting Tito's partisans in Yugoslavia. A Marauder of 25 Squadron SAAF, lost on the unit's last mission of the Second World War on May 4, 1945, was the last Marauder to be lost in combat by any user. The British and South African aircraft were quickly scrapped following the end of the war, the United States not wanting the return of the Lend-Lease aircraft. France, following Operation Torch, the Free French Air Force re-equipped 3 bomber squadrons with Marauders for medium bombing operations in Italy and the Allied invasion of southern France. These B-26s replaced Lyra copyrighted Olivier Leo 451s and Douglas DB-7s. Toward the end of the war, 7 of the 9 French groups de bombardment used the Marauder, taking part in 270 missions with 4,884 aircraft sorties in combat. Free French B-26 groups were disbanded in June 1945. Replaced in squadron service by 1947, 2 lingered on as testbeds for the Snecma Atar jet engine, one of these remaining in use until 1958. Variants: B-26 the first 201 planes were ordered based upon design alone. Prototypes were not distinguished with the usual X or Y designations. 2 Pratt & Whitney A2800-5 engines. The armament consisted of 2.30 caliber and 2.50 caliber machine guns. Approximate cost then, $80,226.80 per aircraft. B-26 or Euro incorporated changes made on the production line to the B-26, including upgrading the 2.30 caliber machine guns in the nose and tail to .50 caliber. A total of 52 B-26s were delivered to the Royal Air Force, which were used as the Marauder Mki. Approximate cost then, $102,659.33 per aircraft, B-26 bar Euro model with further improvements on the B-26A, including revised tail gunners glazing. 19 were delivered to the Royal Air Forces as the Marauder Mkia. Production blocks of the 1,883 aircraft built, AT-23A or TB-26 bar Euro 208 B-26Bs converted into target tugs and gunnery trainers designated JM1 by the Navy. B-26 bar Euro single tail gun replaced with twin gun. Belly-mounted tunnel gun added. B-26B1 a Euro improved B-26B, B-26B2 a Euro Pratt & Whitney A2800-41 radials. B-26B3 a Euro larger carburetor intakes. Upgrade to a 2800-43 radials. B-26B4 a Euro improved B-26B3. B-26B10 through B-26B55 a Euro beginning with Block 10, the wingspan was increased from 65 feet to 71 feet, to improve handling problems during landing caused by a high wing load. Flaps were added outboard of the engine nacelles for this purpose also. The vertical stabilizer height was increased from 19 feet 10 inches to 21 feet 6 inches. The armament was increased from 6 to 12.50 caliber machine guns. This was done in the forward section so that the B-26 could perform strafing missions. The tail gun was upgraded from manual to power-operated. Armor was added to protect the pilot and co-pilot. CB-26 bar Euro 12 B-26Bs were converted into transport aircraft. B-26 Canadian Euros designation assigned to those B-26Bs built in Omaha, Nebraska instead of Baltimore, Maryland. Although nominally the B-26B10 was the first variant to receive the longer wing, it was actually installed on B-26CS before the B-26B10, both being in production simultaneously. A total of 123 B-26CS were used by the RAF and SAAF as the Marauder Mk2. Approximate cost then, $138,551.27 per aircraft, TB-26 Canadian Euros originally designated AT-23B. Trainer modification of B-26C. XB-26 Euro modified B-26 used to test hot air de-icing equipment, in which heat exchangers transferred heat from engine exhaust to air circulated to the leading and trailing edges of the wing and empennage surfaces. This system, while promising, was not incorporated into any production aircraft made during World War II. B-26A Euro modified B-26B constructed to test the effectiveness of moving the dorsal gun turret from the aft fuselage to just behind the cockpit. The offensive and defensive abilities of the B-26E was tested against in combat simulations against normal aircraft. Although tests showed that gains were made with a new arrangement, the gain was insignificant. After a cost analysis, it was concluded that the effort needed to convert production lines to the B-26E arrangement was not worth the effort. B-26 FAR Euro angle of incidence of wings increased by 3.5 Fixed .50 caliber machine gun in nose removed. Tail turret and associated armor improved. The first B-26F was produced in February 1944. 100 of these were B-26F-1MAs. Starting with 42 to 96,231, a revised oil cooler was added, along with wing bottom panels redesigned for easier removal. A total of 200 of the 300 aircraft were B-26F2s and F6s, all of which were used by the RAF and SAAF as the Marauder Mk3. The F2 had the Bell M6 power turret replaced by an M6A with a flexible canvas cover over the guns. The T-1 bomb sight was installed instead of the M-series sight. British bomb fusing and radio equipment were provided. B-26 GAR Euro B-26F with standardized interior equipment. A total of 150 bombers were used by the RAF as the Marauder Mk3. TB-26G Euro B-26G converted for crew training. Most, possibly all, were delivered to the United States Navy as the JM-2. XB-26H Euro test aircraft for tandem landing gear, and nicknamed the Middle River Stump Jumper from its bicycle gear configuration, to see if it could be used on the Martin XB-48. JM-1 Pascal Euro. A small number of JM-1s were converted into photo reconnaissance aircraft for the U.S. Navy. Marauder I. British designation for 52 B-26s for the Royal Air Force. Marauder IA, British designation for 19 B-26BS for the Royal Air Force. Marauder II, British designation for 123 B-26CS for the Royal Air Force and South African Air Force. Marauder III, British designation for 350 B-26F and B-26GS for the Royal Air Force and South African Air Force. With the exception of the B-26C, all models and variants of the B-26 were produced at Martin's Middle River, Maryland manufacturing plant. The B-26C was built at the Martin plant in Omaha, Nebraska. Operators: A. France, Free France, A. South Africa, South African Air Force, A. United Kingdom, Royal Air Force, A. United States Army Air Corps, United States Army Air Forces, United States Marine Corps, United States Navy, Women Air Force Service Pilots, Survivors. France, B-26G, 44 to 68,219 Dynamite, Utah Beach Museum on loan from the Musa copyright E de la de Space in Le Bourget. It was previously recovered from the Air France Training School. United States, airworthy. B-26. 40-1464, part of the Fantasy of Flight collection in Polk City, Florida. This aircraft is reported to be maintained in flying condition, though it has not flown in several years. A B-26B that originally saw service as an aircrew training aircraft awaiting deployment in WWI after being delivered to the USAAF sometime in 1940. The aircraft made a forced landing in the Smith River, British Columbia on January 15, 1942 while on a training mission. It remained at this location for nearly the next 3 decades. The Military Aircraft Restoration Corporation located the wreck in 1971, and after an extensive recovery effort between September and November of that year, the intact sections of the aircraft were transported to Chino, California for possible restoration. From then on it went under a long-term restoration at the Market Chino Airport. It was finally restored to airworthiness in 1991 and was registered by the FAA as N4297J in April 1991. It appeared at several local airshows and aviation events throughout California and the Midwestern U.S. during the 1990s as one of just 2 airworthy B-26 Marauders worldwide. Sometime in 1998 the aircraft was purchased by aircraft collector Kermit Weeks and flew from Chino to Polk City, Florida with several stops. That year its ownership was transferred to Fantasy of Flight, a local air museum owned by Kermit Weeks. In the late 1990s and early 2000s it made frequent public appearances throughout Florida and surrounding states. After Weeks acquired other important restorations, B-26 flights decreased. Its last confirmed flight was in 2004 during the MacDill Air Force Base Air Show. Since then it has remained in the display hangars of Fantasy of Flight, available for public viewing regularly and occasionally being towed outside during special events at the museum. Although it is still a very popular attraction and one of the most iconic aircraft among Kermit Weeks' vast collection, plans to fly the aircraft have been obscure. On the Fantasy of Flight official website the aircraft is still reported to be in airworthy condition, but if it will ever fly again is undetermined. On display: B-26G. 43 to 34,581 shooting in, National Museum of the United States Air Force at Wright-Patterson AFB in Dayton, Ohio. This aircraft was flown in combat by the Free French Air Force during the final months of World War II. It was obtained from the Mechanics Training School of French airline Air France near Paris in June 1965. It is painted as a 9th Air Force B-26B assigned to the 387th Bombardment Group in 1945. Under restoration. B-26. 40-1370, for display by Hill Aerospace Museum, Hill Air Force Base, Utah, 40-1459, for display by Maps Air Museum in Akron, Ohio, 40-1501, for display by David Torlish's Military Aircraft Restoration Corporation of Anaheim, California. At the Pimer Air and Space Museum, adjacent to Davis-Monthan AFB in Tucson, Arizona. B-26B. 41-31773 flak bait, for display at the Stephen F. Vorhazy Center of the National Air and Space Museum in Chantilly, Virginia. This aircraft survived 207 operational missions over Europe, more than any other American aircraft during World War II. Specifications. Data from Quest for Performance and Jane's Fighting Aircraft of World War II. General characteristics: crew, 7, length 58 feet 3 inches, wingspan, 71 feet 0 in, height, 21 feet 6 in, wing area, 658 ft2, empty weight, 24,000 pounds, loaded weight, 37,000 pounds, power plant, 2 Pratt & Whitney A2800-43 radial engines, 2,000 to 2,200 horsepower each, performance, maximum speed, 287 miles per hour at 5,000 feet, cruise speed, 216 miles per hour, landing speed, 114 miles per hour, combat radius, 1,150 miles, ferry range, 2,850 miles, service ceiling, 21,000 feet, wing loading, 46.4 pounds FTA squared, power mass, 0.10 horsepower per pound, armament, guns, 12.50 in Browning machine guns, bombs, 4,000 pounds, see also. Related development, Martin XB-27, Martin XB-33, aircraft of comparable role, configuration and era, de Havilland Mosquito, Dornier Do-217, Douglas A-26 Invader, Mitsubishi G4M, North American B-25 Mitchell, Vickers Wellington. Related lists, list of aircraft of World War II, list of bomber aircraft, list of military aircraft of the United States, references, notes. Citations. Bibliography. External links, Boer, Joe. Martin B-26 Marauder. Encyclopedia of American Aircraft. Manual, AN01-35EB1 Pilots Flight Operating Instructions for Army Models B-26B1 and -26C British Model Marauder II airplanes. How to fly the B-26 airplane on YouTube. The Army asked for a miracle. The answer was the B-26 early 1943 article. Photos of early B-26s, B-26 Marauder digital collection at the University of Akron Archival Services.